Hello and welcome to the Craft Beer Corner. For today's episode, we're jumping into one of my absolute favorite styles of beer, porters. Today we've got three that all sound really decadent and dessert-like. So I'm really excited to jump into all three of these. Only one brewer have I had beers from, and there was a caveat to that, and that's the middle one by Evil Twin. But the other two are brand new brewers to me. So today we're going to be reviewing Caldera Brewing's Toasted Coconut Chocolate Porter. This is a 6.2% ABV porter, and they are based out of Ashland, Oregon. Second is Evil Twin Brewing Company's Imperial Wedding Cake Break. This is an imperial porter. It's brewed with coffee, vanilla, almonds, and actual wedding cake. 11.5% ABV, so it is indeed imperial. Evil Twin is based out of Brooklyn, New York. Though, caveat on this one. This specific beer was produced and canned for Evil Twin by Westbrook Brewing Company out of Mount Pleasant, South Carolina. So I am certain that it's Evil Twin's actual recipe and exactly everything to spec that they designed, but they did not actually brew it themselves. It was brewed by Westbrook Brewing out of Mount Pleasant, South Carolina. And we will finish off with WIngman Brewers S'mores Porter, brewed with marshmallow, graham cracker, and chocolate. 7.5% ABV on this one out of Tacoma, Washington. This one particularly excites me. They all do, but this one in particular, s'mores, are one of my all-time top favorite desserts. It's a very simple snack, campfire snack dessert, but I absolutely love it. The simplicity of the ingredients that just meld so well together. I cannot wait for this. Porters, and all of them with amazing sounding recipes here. So we're gonna jump right in, starting with the Caldera Brewing's Toasted Coconut Chocolate Porter, 6.2% ABV. Okay, so jumping straight into our first beer today, this is the Caldera Brewing's Toasted Coconut Chocolate Porter out of Ashland, Oregon. This one clocks in at 6.2% ABV. And I didn't mention this in the intro, but indeed this is not brewed with artificial flavors. It's actual toasted coconut and chocolate that went into brewing this beer. This is one of the ones I've never tried. I've never had a beer by Caldera. Sounds really good to me. So let's go ahead and get this poured into the glass here. Oh, that's a beautiful dark brown porter. That looks lovely. Absolutely lovely. Quite effervescent. Formed quite a bit of a head there, though it's not super tight, foamy, creamy bubbles, so I expect this head is going to collapse pretty quickly here, and let us jump in. Holding it up, it is not pitch black as the night, which is true for a porter. It shouldn't be, but it's very dark. It looks lovely. This looks like a quintessential porter. I'm going to go ahead and give it a sniff. That smells quite nice. It smells like it's going to be well balanced. It smells very much of a strong, solid porter backbone with toasted coconut and chocolate. You can smell it really in even balance in the aroma. If that's any indication of what this is going to taste like, I think I'm in for a treat here. Head has already settled down quite a bit there, so this is looking pretty good to dive right in. I'm going to do just that. Okay. I'm going to give it a minute before I render any opinions on the taste. All right. Here's the deal with this one. It's a little interesting because up front and for the first, probably through the first 3 to 5 seconds, it tastes very sweet, like really sweet. Which is peculiar for a porter. It is not typically a sweet style of beer at all. After it opens into that, breaks away from that sweetness, then it starts to open beautifully into this just lush, classic porter malt backbone. And it's got really nice, deeply roasted malts in there. Got It's really nice. I've talked about this many times, that kind of edge of the roasting just before the smoke point on a finely roasted French roast coffee bean. It's got that quality to the malt, that borderline smokiness and earthiness, and that pairs so well with the chocolate that comes through. It's definitely dark chocolate, and the coconut comes in as well. It's kind of on the back of the malt backbone and the chocolate that pairs with the malt backbone. Then you start to get the toasted coconut. In the flavor, the toasted coconut is not as pronounced as it is in equal parts on the aroma, but it's still there, and it's very nice. This is a good beer. All of the flavors are really nice. The sweetness is a little interesting. I'm not the biggest fan of having a big mouth of any modicum of sweetness in a porter that I'm drinking. But I'm going to give it a fair shake, give it another taste, a couple taste samples. First, I want to jump in and see if I can pinpoint the body and the mouthfeel here. The body is medium to medium heavy. It's a classic porter body. It's actually a little bit more robust than I would anticipate for the ABV, only 6.2, but it's got some substance. The mouthfeel is not quite up to the standard of a normal porter. It's a little meh. It's okay. It doesn't have much viscosity. It doesn't feel like it has that much weight, and it's quite effervescent, which you could tell from how effervescent this was. It still is going. I know you can't see it in the sides of the glass, but it's quite effervescent, and that's why that head broke down so quickly. All of the flavors that went into this porter, they really only come on the back third of the finish. Up front, it's got this very peculiar, it almost tastes like a mix of prunes and raisins. That's kind of what comes through with the sweetness. It's a very peculiar flavor to taste in a porter. For me personally, it's a little off-putting. I don't want to say it's bad, but it's not what you would normally find in a porter. I'm not saying that's either good or bad at all. To each his own. For me, I'd prefer to not have that there. I would prefer to just taste the nice, deep, rich porter roasted malts, and then have that open beautifully and pair with the chocolate and the coconut, which you still get, but it's really only on the back third of the finish, which is the majority of the taste that gets the actual namesake of what this beer is. Toasted coconut chocolate porter. I'm only getting any of that on the back third. Still an enjoyable beer. I'm going to take my time and really scrutinize this and take a few more test samples just to make sure that my initial impressions are right, and I will come up with the scores for this one. But up next, we're going to be moving on to the Evil Twin Brewing Company's Imperial Wedding Cake Break. This is the Imperial Porter of the bunch, and this one has added coffee, vanilla, almonds, and actual wedding cake in it. 11.5% ABV on this one. All right, moving on to our second beer. This is the Evil Twin Brewing Company's Imperial Wedding Cake Break. This is the one Imperial Porter of the bunch, brewed with coffee, vanilla, almonds, and wedding cake, as in actual wedding cake dumped into the tanks while brewing. 11.5% ABV on this one. Evil Twin is out of Brooklyn, New York. Though to recap, caveat on this one, this was produced and canned for them by Westbrook Brewing out of Mount Pleasant, South Carolina. So they didn't actually brew it in-house. Nonetheless, you know, even just looking at the can art, it really makes you want to dive right into here. Wedding cake beer. I expect this is a genius move. We're about to find out. Evil Twin does a ton of innovative and interesting beers, throwing in things that people never would. You know, do a little research on Evil Twin. They're an interesting bunch. Nonetheless, let's get this poured. I expect this will be quite a bit thicker than the... Oh, this is as thick as an Imperial Stout. Just a porter. This is looking lovely. In fact, if you know about stouts and porters, all stouts are porters, but not all porters are stouts. And indeed, based on the ABV alone, this technically should classify as an Imperial Stout. The ABV is too high for a porter. It's one of the clear delineations between stouts and porters. Nonetheless, looks great, and it is dark as molasses, pitch black. They can call it what they want, but as an Imperial, I won't even term the classification. It looks perfect. The head, not super duper creamy, but it did form relatively nicely. It's going to dissipate very quickly. It's got too many tight, fast, medium bubbles coming through, so it's going to dissipate quickly. Let's give it a sniff. It smells really good. I can get the vanilla up front, and there's some other sweetness. It's probably the wedding cake. It's hard to pick out. I mean, what would that smell like in a beer? I'm not really picking up the coffee or the almond at all. Actually, just a hint of almond, but it's predominantly the vanilla and just some underlying sweetness. Nonetheless, it smells fantastic. It looks fantastic. Let's jump right in, give this a sip. Okay, that's a good beer. That's a big beer. Very, very flavorful. Very rich, very decadent, boozy. It's got a nice booze back to it, which at 11.5%, some people dislike that. I like it. I like a beer. I don't want it overtly boozy, but I want to taste some booze under and overtones to let me know it's a high ABV beer, and this doesn't disappoint. The coffee does come through. The vanilla definitely comes through. The wedding cake, I'm not really sure where it comes into this. It's in there. Probably help boost up the ABV with all that frosting, and certainly the cake itself with the sugar in it. Not really detecting any almond. For me, that would probably be a challenging ingredient to get a flavor into a beer. Perhaps maybe using an almond flavored, I hate to say it, creamer or even almond milk, but that doesn't really taste of almond. Almond butter perhaps would be a good way to infuse the flavor of almond, but actual almond, even if it's finely ground, I mean, short of having some wetness and thickness to it, almond oil, I'm not sure how you would impart that flavor into a batch. It's a good beer. It's quite heavy. It's quite heavy. It's got a very, very big body. This is a heavy beer. The mouthfeel is quite smooth, but as you might expect, it's also quite viscous. Very, very viscous. It really sticks around the mouth. So classic, exactly as I expected body and mouthfeel. I am not let down by that at all. Indeed, I'm not let down really by anything at all. I'm going to have one more sip just to see if I can pick out where the flavors come in along the sensory ride of the taste and the finish. Up front, it's booze. Booze mixed with vanilla. Still booze and vanilla. Then it starts to open up into coffee. A little bit of the malt backbone, just some extra roastiness. It could be due in part to the type of coffee that they used. It could be a deep, deep roast, like a French roast I talk about a lot. But that's really where this beer goes. Now we're in here, but I say, oh wow, that tastes of wedding cake. Not at all. It doesn't taste like cake in the slightest. It doesn't taste like frosting in the slightest. There's nothing about this beer that screams wedding cake to me. I'm sure that it's in there, and I'm sure that it brought something to the table that's in this beer, because this is a very big, complex beer. It's very, very good. It's got a lot to think about. It's got a lot of presence. This puts me in mind of the Hubbard's Cave Imperial Stouts that I've reviewed, the couple I've done. This is very much along that same line. This is excellent, excellent beer. As it were, I'm a massive fan. I'm going to take my time picking this one apart and really, really think about my sensory experience as I go through the categories. But when we come back, we'll move on to our third and final beer, which is the WIngman Brothers S'mores Porter. I cannot wait for this one. Absolutely brewed with proper marshmallow, graham crackers, and chocolate. That one's 7.5% ABV, and it's out of Tacoma, Washington. All right, so jumping into our third and final beer of today's porter review, we're moving on to the WIngman Brewers S'mores Porter. brewed with marshmallow, graham cracker, and chocolate, the three ingredients in s'mores, one of my absolute favorite desserts on the face of the planet Earth. I am super, super excited to jump in and try this. I can't believe it. Out of all the thousands of beers I've had, I've never had a s'mores beer, and I've seen them, and I've always wanted to try one, so finally I'm doing just that. The label on here is kind of funny. It's got a Sasquatch or Yeti or Bigfoot, whatever you care to term them, with a s'more on a stick. Lit a flame from a campfire, presumably. Nonetheless, let's go ahead and get this poured into our glass. Ooh, this is thick. That's very thick for a porter. It's quite dark. It actually seems very, very effervescent too, though it didn't create a giant head. I mean, it's bubbling away almost like a soda does. Really, there are bubbles just all over this glass, and I can see it just going up crazy. It's literally, you can see them popping on the surface of the beer. That's insane. I haven't seen a beer that effervescent, this dark, probably ever. Nonetheless, jump in, give it a sniff. Okay. Not the most pronounced nose in the world. The aroma doesn't come through super duper strongly, but what I can smell is a really nice balance of malt and sweetness from the presumably marshmallow and chocolate. Now, actually trying to pick out and detect and say, oh, that's marshmallow, graham cracker, chocolate, I can't quite do that. It all kind of smells like an amalgam. You really got to get in there and give a good sniff, but you know, it smells nice. It smells good. And the fact that I can still smell the malt bill behind it gives me high hope. Again, I forgot to mention 7.5% on this one. It's out of Tacoma, Washington. That's important details. Let's jump right in and give this a sip. It's very interesting. Not remotely what I expected in the slightest. Okay. Up front, it actually tastes quite boozy. And then it opens up to this flavor that's not dissimilar to how the first beer, the Caldera Brewing's Toasted Coconut Chocolate Porter, opened up. This peculiar, almost raisin or prune-like sweetness that's behind it, which is a little off-putting in a porter. It's hard to describe. Can I actually taste marshmallow, graham cracker, and or chocolate in this beer? No. In fact, none of the ingredients of a s'mores can I taste in this at all. At least my initial impression. Gonna jump back in, give it another sip, think on the body and the mouthfeel and the finish, and really start to pick apart this flavor profile. The body, it's lighter than you would expect, considering how thickly it poured and how high the ABV is for a porter. I'd say it's medium. The mouthfeel is quite flat, about the consistency, thickness of water. There's really not much viscosity, so to speak. It's very effervescent as well. Not a traditional porter mouthfeel. The finish is quite dry, and it lasts a reasonably long time, but unfortunately it's letting me down in that it's just got that booze up front, then this peculiar sweetness with flavors that just don't belong, A, in a porter, and B, in a porter that's billing itself as a s'mores porter. I just don't get the s'mores at all. Perhaps, and I have no reason to believe that it wasn't brewed with marshmallow, graham cracker, and chocolate, but there's something off in the balance or something in the process that's off, that's not letting these flavors come through, and that's generated these bizarre, deep, rich, fruity flavors instead. It's not bad, but it certainly is not what I look for at all in a porter at all. This is, if I had this porter at a bar, I would certainly not order another glass. Yeah, this beer, this one's just not doing it for me. It's missing the je ne sais quoi. It's missing that it factor. It's not a bad beer. It's not a bad beer, don't get me wrong. And when the malts do finally come through on the end, it's a very nice tasting malt bill. But it's overshadowed by this just peculiar, borderline off-putting sweetness that just doesn't belong. And that none of the flavors of the s'mores come through really in the slightest. That's very disappointing. I was so excited for this beer. I had such high hopes that I would be able to have a beer that tastes like s'mores and just, oh my gosh, like I finally had a peanut or peanut butter, take your pick, your style, Anapi Brewery's PB Hobo beer that purported to be, it blew my mind. It was hands down the best I've ever had in my life. I mean, nothing else. It's not even a contest. This beer is in an entire different constellation from everybody else's attempts. I was hoping that this would be a s'mores equivalent to the Anapi's PB Hobo, only for s'mores versus peanuts, but this is just not it. So the search continues for me for a s'mores beer. I'm not disappointed that I got to try it, and again, I stand by this. The malt bill in this is quite nice. It's a very solid porter. It tastes like a porter should when it finally comes in. It's just such the back end, minuscule part of the overall flavor profile. It's that peculiar, really deep, rich fruit sweetness that's 80–85% of the entire flavor sensory experience and through the end of the finish. It only on the tail end do you get those malts they're quite nice. It's clearly well chosen malts. Tastes like a porter should, but it's just too minimal. Nonetheless, I'm going to take my time. I'm going to work up my scores for this one, and we'll come back and we will rank all three from top to bottom. All right, now that we have gotten to sample all three beers, we're going to go through and get their ratings. Certainly, one of these beers stood head and shoulders above the other two, but we'll get to that and explain why. We're going to start with Caldera Brewing's Toasted Coconut Chocolate Porter, 6.2% ABV out of Ashland, Oregon. The aroma on this one was not super pronounced, and really all I could get was the coconut. Couldn't really get a whiff of the chocolate at all, but it smelled nice, just wasn't that pronounced. I gave it a 6. The taste on this was okay. It was average for my money. It just wasn't well balanced in the flavor profile. This one had some peculiar kind of raisiny, pruny sweetness that went to that's just contrary to porters and contrary to toasted coconut and chocolate. I don't know where that flavor is coming from or what, but it didn't really hit the mark for the taste for me. I gave it the high end of average because the actual malt backbone of the porter was pretty good. It tasted nice, quality ingredients. And the coconut did come through. It just drowned out the chocolate and that peculiar sweetness. I couldn't rate it higher than a 6. The body on this, for 6.2% porter, the body was quite thin. Not bad thin for a porter. It was just much thinner than I anticipated. Low end of average, I gave it a 4 there. The mouthfeel on this, it was okay. It was okay for a porter. This was one that was really quite effervescent, which is atypical for a porter. And it didn't have much viscosity, so to speak, which porters tend to have a little substance to them, much like stouts, even if they're not imperial, but just gave it average, 5 for the mouthfeel. The finish on this, the finish wasn't super long at all. And it lacked such balance of the flavors that this set out to be. As a toasted coconut chocolate porter, sure, I got the coconut, hardly a hint of chocolate, just a little bitter on the back, and only a tail end of the porter malt bill, but this bizarre sweetness, just deep rich fruit like prune and raisins. It was just weird. It kind of threw everything off. So just 6 for the finish. The head and retention on this, it was pretty good. Pretty good to be out of a bottle for a porter. I gave that above average. I gave it a 7. The appearance on this was lovely. This was rather a textbook porter. I did give that a perfect 10 out of 10. Absolutely nailed that aspect. The balance on this again. The sweetness just killed so much in this beer, and then the coconut drowned out so the chocolate that it just wasn't well balanced. It wasn't bad. It was just average. I gave it a 5. Feeling in the intangibles, I give this a 5 as well, and it's for the same reasons that I've mentioned a few times. This peculiar sweetness and lack of balance between the main flavors that they're putting in this porter. I just could not give it higher than a 5. Finally, as an example of the style, I give it a 5 for the exact same reason. That brings the total score on Caldera Brewing's Toasted Coconut Chocolate Porter to a 59 out of 100. So this falls squarely in the average range. It's kind of on the higher end of average, but still just average for my money. Moving on to number 2, this is Evil Twin's Imperial Wedding Cake Break, which is the Imperial Porter of the bunch, brewed with coffee, vanilla, almonds, and actual wedding cake. 11.5% ABV. They are out of Brooklyn, though, as we mentioned several times. This was brewed by a different brewer based in Mount Pleasant, South Carolina. Nonetheless, jumping to aroma, the aroma on this was much, much more pronounced than the Caldera. You could really smell it quite strongly. It wasn't upper echelon, but well above average. I gave it an 8. The taste on this was nice. It had a lot going for it. It was a big beer, which I've come to expect and love about Evil Twin, and it didn't let me down. I only wish that I could have picked out the wedding cake and the almonds. I just didn't get any of that in the flavor profile. If I had gotten even a hint of either, I probably would have given it higher, but as it were, still a very high score, 8 out of 10 for the taste. The body on this, as you might expect, as an Imperial, it was huge, perfect 10 out of 10. Mouthfeel on this, as an Imperial, it was textbook. It was super smooth, and it was ridiculously viscous, and it let it all linger, and it was just perfect for a mouthfeel. 10 out of 10. The finish on this. Finish on this was not as long as I was anticipating, especially considering how big and heavy the body was and how thick and viscous the mouthfeel was, and how much that beer just stuck all around the palate. But it just dissipated quite a bit quicker than I thought it would for an Imperial that had that much substance. It was still above average. I gave it a 7. Head retention on this, it was okay. It collapsed much quicker than I thought that it would, but again, I've mentioned this over and over again, and it definitely bears repeating every time. Cleanliness of the glassware, luck of the draw, how well or poorly you pour the beer, and many other factors are going to go into how well your head forms and retains when you're pouring it at home, when it's not on a tap. So it still got above average. I gave it a 7. The appearance on this was perfect for an Imperial. It was black as night. You could not see a hint of light through it. 10 out of 10. The balance on this, it was a very well balanced beer, and it did have a little boozy quality to it, which, as you know, I do appreciate in a higher ABV beer. I don't want it to be overtly boozy where it drowns out the experience of the flavor profile of everything else that goes into making the beer, but I like when it makes itself present and then it gets out of the way and lets you enjoy the flavors. But I enjoyed it. The only thing that I knocked points on the balance for was I just didn't get the almonds in the wedding cake. And that's 50% of the ingredients that went into this, and the one ingredient after which this beer is named. Kind of goes to show you just how good and how well balanced every other aspect was that it got as high of a score as it did, that considering it did get a 7 for the balance. Feeling in the intangible, I really enjoyed it. I did have to dock points though due to the absence of almond or wedding cake flavor or anything that even reminded me of cake or cake frosting. I just didn't get any of that at all in this beer, which I was really hoping to, but it was still excellent. I give it a 7. Finally, as an example of the style, this is a very good Imperial Porter. If they had just called this coffee vanilla Imperial Porter, I probably would have rated this much higher, but as it were, it's a wedding cake break, including almonds and wedding cake that just didn't come through for me. So I had to dock some points, but it was still excellent. Excellent example of the style. I gave it a 7. That brings the total score on Evil Twins Imperial Wedding Cake Break to an 81 out of 100. And that brings us to our third and final beer. WIngman Brothers S'mores Porter, brewed with marshmallow, graham cracker, and chocolate, 7.5% ABV out of Tacoma, Washington. The aroma on this, it smelled good, but it wasn't a very pronounced aroma. And really, you couldn't pick out any marshmallow, graham cracker, or chocolate. It just smelled like porter, and it smelled slightly sweet. And I was hopeful from that sweetness, even though it wasn't that pronounced. But as you'll see as I go through the rest, I was disappointed once the beer opened it to its own. So 5 for the aroma. The taste, this, much like the other one, but far more pronounced, had this peculiar, overwhelming, overpowering prune, raisin, deep, rich fruit sweetness that is just so out of place, A, in the beer style, and B, for what they're trying to do with the beer. A s'mores porter, there was not a hint of s'mores in sight. There was not any semblance of marshmallow, graham cracker, or chocolate at all that came through in the flavor profile of this beer. The only redemption that got it to the score that it did was once on the final 10-15% of the finish, I could actually taste the malts that made up the porter malt bill. They were actually really well done. It was well-selected malts, clearly of a high quality, and it tasted as a porter should. But it was just such a minute part of the overall flavor profile, and that weird, just off-putting sweetness was so dominant, I couldn't give it higher than a 4. Moving on to the body, had a decent body. It was above average. For a 7.5% porter, I would have expected it to be quite a bit more robust, but it was still above average. I gave the body a 6. The mouthfeel, I gave the same as I did the body. I expected it to have more viscosity, and it was a bit effervescent for my liking for a porter, but still above average. I gave it a 6. The finish on this, the finish was quite long. Not upper echelon long, but it was quite long. And considering what the finish entails, it really is predominantly about the length and how it lets you pick out the flavors. While I didn't particularly enjoy what I was experiencing, it was a nice finish, well above average. I gave it an 8. The head retention on this was abysmal. It essentially didn't form one whatsoever. It was far too effervescent, very much like looking at a soda down in a glass, and it just destroyed any chance of really forming a head at all. I mean, it was there, and then it was gone. Well below average, I gave it a 3. The appearance, it redeems itself on the score rank. It was beautiful. Textbook, I gave it a perfect 10 out of 10. It was a lovely, lovely porter. Moving on to the balance. This was a very, very poorly balanced beer. This is not even average. It was just poorly balanced. The flavors that went into it did not come through in the slightest. That rich fruit, deep raisin prune flavor profile came through, and I don't even know what that's about. How they could both get that flavor, two completely separate beers, both going for flavored porters, I don't know. But it was not right, and it overshadowed everything until the very end, and you got the malt bill. I couldn't give it higher than a 3 for the balance. Feeling in the intangible, I was not a fan. I was very disappointed. I was so hopeful, and then when I tried it, it was a massive, massive letdown. I gave it another 3. Finally, as an example of the style, as a porter, if they had not put anything else in it, and if somehow adding the other ingredients is what made this peculiar, sweet, weird fruit flavor come through in the beer, like on this one, probably would have had a really good score because it was a nice tasting porter malt bill. But as it were, I mean, I'm sorry, as a s'mores porter, this is not a good beer. It is not, in my opinion, it is below average. The porter would have been fine, but everything else that came through in this beer was just so off-putting and overwhelming. I could not give it higher than a 3 again. So example of the style, it gets a 3. That brings the total score on the Wingman Brothers S'mores Porter to a 51. This might be the lowest rated beer I've done to date. It's not bad. It's just not what it's billed to be. It got some categories right and some very, very wrong. But it falls squarely in the average range. If you're looking for an average beer, there you go. My unadulterated opinion and all the reasons behind it. Nonetheless, as excited as I was to get into porters and try something that sounded so good and how disappointed I was, I still enjoyed it. I always love trying new beers, for better or for worse. It's always something new to experience, and that's part of the fun of it. You win some and you lose some, and that's okay. We try again and discover more that we either like or don't like or love or hate. That's the beauty of it. Nonetheless, ladies and gentlemen, as always, I do thank you for turning in. We are growing our channel, of course. You hear this all the time, but it really does help if you consider liking and subscribing. It helps us move up into the rankings in YouTube and helps other people find our content. And certainly, if you want to keep in the loop when our videos go live, you can click the notification bell, and that will let you know right when they get published and go live on YouTube. Until then, keep it beer, keep it craft. We'll see you in the next one. Cheers.